Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and of course, we have already read and reviewed every single mystery novel written by Agatha Christie, but that does not mean that there isn't more to discuss in the world of Agatha Christie appreciation, and we are covering some new ground in this episode. I was fortunate enough to sit down with Booktuber Mara Sinclair. We discussed what Booktube is and talked a whole lot of Christie. But first, I have one item of housekeeping to take care of. This will be really quick because it's just a correction having to do with my previous episode. So when I covered In a Glass Darkly, I mentioned how on the official Agatha Christie website, there's this note about how a newspaper incorrectly announced that Agatha Christie would be reading out this story on the radio, but they had been confusing her with Dorothy Sayers. That is not actually the case, and I would have known this at the time of recording if I had consulted either Mark Aldridge or Tony Medower, 2 of my Christie experts whose research underlies so much of what I tell you on this podcast. Alas, I did not consult them in this case, much to my chagrin, because the true story is way more interesting than the false one and involves a Miss Marple short story that we've already covered. Miss Marple Tells a Story. Here is what Mark has to say about this in his book, Agatha Christie on Screen. It is well known that she wrote the short mystery Miss Marple Tells a Story for the radio before its later appearance in print. But it is less well known that this was a last-minute replacement for another story that the BBC had found unsuitable. After agreeing to a fee of 30 guineas, less than the £50 she had wanted, Christie sent Ackerley is a BBC producer, Christie sent Ackerley her story In a Glass Darkly in March 1934, possibly with the working or optional title of In the Mirror. Very quickly, Ackerley realized that Christie's supernatural tale of a man who has a prophetic vision of a murder was not what was wanted for the slot, and a replacement was requested. Correspondence from Christie then indicates that she was asked to formulate something along the lines of a Miss Marple mystery, which she duly did, and that may explain the prosaic title of the final story. So last minute was the replacement that the Daily Mirror actually incorrectly included In a Glass Darkly in its listings for the 6th of April 1934. In the end, Miss Marple Tells a Story was read out by its author on the Light program on the 11th of May, 1934. That is what Mark had to say, and I think we can reasonably presume that on the 6th of April, 1934, when In a Glass Darkly was supposed to have been read, is when that Dorothy Sayers story was read out. So it really wasn't the newspaper's fault. It was the BBC's fault, and maybe Christie's fault, for not getting their proverbial ducks in a row on time. Now, that is really interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, this short story was written to be read out on the radio, which I did not realize when I did my episode. And I think that accounts for the ways in which it works so well on the screen in that Agatha Christie Hour adaptation. It also accounts for how short it is and how economically written. That's part of what I really loved about the story. And I maintain the fact that Christie is an economical, efficient writer, even when she's writing for the page, but especially when she's writing for radio, because it is a different sort of prose. So it's really important, and I wanted to make that distinction and make sure that you are all aware of that distinction. The second reason why that excerpt is interesting is because Mark makes reference to the fact that Agatha Christie herself read out Miss Marple Tells a Story in 1934 on the radio, which is one of those fun facts, one of those Christie trivia facts that we all love to tell each other. The fact that technically Agatha Christie herself is the first person to have played, quote unquote, played Agatha Christie on the radio. But that is not actually true. And I am not going to tell you what the real story is, because that is something that Mark covers in his new book, all about Miss Jane Marple, which is coming out later in 2024, I believe in June 2024. I'm sure that we will have him on the podcast to discuss the book, and we can talk about it then. I wouldn't want to spoil any of the amazing research that he did for that book. But I just mentioned that not to point out that there is an error in Mark's book, a rare error in Agatha Christie on Screen, more to highlight the shifting and dynamic nature of research into Agatha Christie. That's not an Agatha Christie specific thing, but when people do research, they're constantly finding out new things and making corrections to what we thought we knew and realizing that we had bad or misleading information, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just really exciting that we are finding out new things about Agatha Christie all the time. And it's why I look forward to new books when they come out, especially by people who are on the ground, putting in the work, doing the research, like my good friend Mark. So there's that. I also heard from my friend Tony about this when he listened to the episode, and he was kind enough to reach out directly, and here is what he had to say. Regarding your comment that In a Glass Darkly may be a rare example of a story working better on the screen than on the page, you may not be aware that the story was originally written for broadcast. Christie wrote it in response to a commission from the BBC for a short story to be read out on the radio. She didn't read it because, as she pointed out in a letter to the BBC, it was intended to be read by a man. As this revelation, Tony uses quotes there, came too close to the broadcast date, the BBC replaced the reading of In a Glass Darkly by a reading by Dorothy L. Sayers of one of her stories. This is what lies behind the mistaken comment that someone had confused Christie and Sayers. There was no such confusion. Christie's story works better on screen than on the page because the page version is effectively the script for a radio broadcast, and to give the listener half a chance of anticipating the outcome, she had to clue the mirror imagery more heavily in what they would be hearing than she would if it had been intended for the page from the outset. That is really interesting, and I appreciate Tony's insight there into how the story works on the page in a slightly different way from a lot of Christie's, because it is unusual for a Christie story to work better on the screen than on the page. And the fact that this is essentially the script for a radio play, or at least a radio story, accounts for that. And far be it from me to cast aspersions on newspaper listings for upcoming BBC broadcasts. It clearly was not the newspaper's fault. You may have noticed that in Mark's accounting of the confusion, it was the Daily Mirror that made the mistake in listing, whereas AgathaChristie.com says it was the Daily Mail. So that's another little wrinkle there. Maybe both of them had listings. I don't know. But with apologies to the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail, the mistake was not theirs. I never thought I would be uttering the phrase with apologies to the Daily Mail on this podcast. That's interesting. But here we are. That is where the long and windy, the torturous road of publication history and provenance has led us for that particular Agatha Christie short story. I spent so much time in that episode on the publication history of the short story, but apparently I needed to spend a couple more minutes because I missed a major element of that publication history. So I just wanted to set the record straight there. With gratitude, as always, to my friends Mark Aldridge and Tony Medower. Let's move off of housekeeping now and get right into the interview. You're going to love it. Mara Sinclair is a booktuber who for the past 6 years has been streaming videos on her own channel, Books Like Whoa, which is basically a book lover's paradise. And don't worry if what I just said sounded like a bit of a word salad. I am going to be asking her exactly what she does and how she does it in just a moment. For now, the most important thing to know is that she is an impassioned lover of books, known for her omnivorous taste and the uniformly critical approach she brings to any book, as well as the high volume of books she gets through each month. Seriously, Mara reads a lot, and I mean a lot of books. In one video, I believe she estimated that she reads at least 200 to 250 a year, and that's in a slow year. A lot of books. So from Oscar Wilde to Ilona Andrews to Agatha Christie to Roxane Gay to the pulpiest of genre, she reads it all, she loves it all, and she'll happily spend hours dissecting it all. Regardless of a particular work's intent to be high art or consumable entertainment, she believes all books deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms, and she loves engaging with other passionate readers. Her motto is, "There is a book for every reader and a reader for every book." And she hopes that by describing her personal experience with any given book, she can help fellow readers find books that will work for their own tastes. So some of the content she is best known for includes her read-alongs of Agatha Christie, which she has done under two umbrellas, Project Poirot and Mission Marple. She also participates in original reading challenges, one of which was centered on Christie, and which I will be asking her about in this interview. And I will just mention, in the ongoing battle that rages just below the surface of this podcast, that her all-time favorite book is Jane Eyre. I say this with triumph, but also with apologies to my former co-host, the much missed, the always missed Catherine Brobeck, who, as many of you know, was a fierce champion of Wuthering Heights and almost as fierce a detractor of my beloved Jane Eyre. Welcome, Mara.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I of course meant to ask you all about Agatha Christie, but since I just mentioned Jane Eyre, and I have to ask you starting out here, do you like Wuthering Heights?
I do, but Kemper, I'm shocked when you said that. It got me a little misty. I was like, oh, I totally forgot that was an ongoing conversation. But yes, I do also enjoy Wuthering Heights, but Jane Eyre speaks to me on a primal level that, 16-year-old Mara can never escape.
Yeah, I think we are on exactly the same page as to both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. I love me some Wuthering Heights. I mean, I love many, many Victorian novels, and it's probably in the upper echelon of the ones that I love. But yeah, Jane Eyre is just, it completes me.
Yeah, I feel like Jane Eyre, for me, is more like philosophically enriching, and Wuthering Heights, I just love for the camp. Like, it just feels so over the top and so fun, though obviously very dark.
Yes.
But Jane Eyre just like... Oh, it was one of those like life-changing books for me.
Absolutely. All right, we're already off to a rollicking start here. So a booktuber is one who posts videos on Booktube. So far, so good. But what is this wondrous place called Booktube?
So Booktube is a little corner of YouTube, and it's very funny because if you look at the overall stats for YouTubers, like even the biggest Booktuber is tiny compared to, the big guys, but it's just a beloved community name of people who are pretty much exclusively posting book-related content. See also BookToker if you are a TikTok creator, or Bookstagrammer if you are a book-related Instagram channel.
Right. So Instagram has Bookstagram and TikTok has BookTok as well. So it's like these little corners of these massive sort of like social media juggernaut platforms that have been co-opted by book lovers. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I think it probably came up originally because that's how you would tag things. So it would be hashtag books, hashtag BookTok. Booktube is the kind of accepted portmanteau, I guess, technically, of that kind of bookish corner of YouTube.
And it seems like, at least in your case, and I would imagine for many people who post on Booktube and Bookstagram and BookTok, that there's a lot of crossover between people who are active there and who also post and review heavily on Goodreads. Goodreads is actually something also that I haven't really mentioned that much on this podcast. I actually did mention it once because I think they had a compilation of reader reviews or reader rankings of Agatha Christie, which was really, really interesting to see, this massive pool of people. If you're going by a much larger number, what were the more popular Christie titles and what were the least popular ones? And that was how I realized that Catherine and I were way over ranking The Pale Horse, for instance, even though I love The Pale Horse. I know you love The Pale Horse too.
I do too.
Right?
I do too. Yeah. I have it pretty high in my rankings. I think it was one I read later, so that might contribute to my fondness for it. But yeah, no, I think it's I stand by your high ranking of The Pale Horse.
But since I feel like we may as well cover what Goodreads is as well. And you strike me as a really good person just to ask about what it is and how you use it and what it's there for.
So Goodreads, well, depending on how you feel about such things, in my opinion, sadly, is a social media site owned by Amazon. But originally it started off as just a place where you could kind of post about what you were reading and other readers could comment on it. So both people who you are friended with, so you kind of see their reviews first when you pull up a page for a book, which can be helpful if you're trying to figure out if it's a book you're going to like. But then also just your reviews get posted for the community. So it's a really good way to go do like research on a book if you're trying to decide if you want to read it. And it's kind of a social media thing. It is technically a social media site. In my opinion, it kind of sits between a more functional reading tracking site and a social media site. Like, the engagement with your friends isn't on the same level as what you would expect from like an Instagram or Twitter or something. I don't know does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like how you put that, because I think that's the thing that's always befuddled me a little bit about Goodreads, because it is interactive, but only up to a certain point. Like, it really is just sort of, well, here's what I read and here's what I think about it. And I can read what you read and what you think about it, but there's no crosstalk, so to speak.
Yeah, you can comment on other people's reviews, and there are some legendarily hilarious comment threads on notorious Goodreads reviews that are well worth seeking out. So you can comment on other people's reviews, but it doesn't have the same level of like, at this person, tagging this person. That's not kind of the vibe of it.
And it's big. This is at least my opinion, and I would love to get your opinion on this as well. And, Goodreads has been in the news recently, but I feel like it's always kind of in the news for good and bad reasons. And unfortunately, recently it's been more for bad reasons, because there's this whole phenomenon of authors getting their books tanked by 1-star reviews even before they've been published, often by people who may not have even read the book, because they just heard, oh, this is a book that is doing or saying something that I don't agree with. And that, seems offensive to me for any number of potentially perfectly valid reasons, but is, just something that I'm going to review badly so that the book has a bad rating without even reading the book and before the book has even come out. And this is something that I think there's a lot of pearl clutching that goes on with Goodreads, yet it persists. And it seems to me that, there's an easy solution to that, which is that perhaps you shouldn't be able to post a review to Goodreads without having proven that you read the book, which is more, I think, what Amazon does on its actual site. You at least have to go through certain motions to more or less prove, not in like an airtight Poirot sort of a way, but to at least make it more likely than not that you have actually read the book before you post a review. But there's no such filter on Goodreads, and that seems to be a problem. But I'm curious how you feel about all of that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic, because I do feel very firmly that reviews are for readers. They're not for authors. They're not for publishers. To me, Goodreads is a reader space. So to some degree, I kind of feel like, well, hey, they should be able to do whatever they want over there. I personally don't think it's good form to post a review of something you've not read, or at least attempted to read. I think because, unfortunately, Goodreads doesn't easily let people mark things as did not finish or a DNF. It creates some complications there. But I think this gets into this is like an age-old topic of discussion in the kind of online bookish communities, because it also gets into this intersection of commerce and the reading experience and sort of the commodification of the reader experience. Because really, the only reason why Goodreads reviews matter to publishers is that if they start having books with low rankings, it could impact their sales. But then you get into, well, if a lot of people really don't like this book, or if an author has such egregious behavior that people feel the need to like tell other readers about it, and that's kind of the outlet they have to do it, is that something that publishers are the right people to get in the middle of? Like, right. I think there's a lot of intersecting interests when it comes to Goodreads.
It's really complicated. I appreciate that I think you're laying out some of those complications really well in a really succinct way, better than I could have. And I think that's such a good point, that it's not an author site. I'll tell you, as someone who's had a book, I have one book under my belt and I have another one coming out soon. Most authors, among themselves say, like, one of their first rules is don't read the Goodreads reviews or the Amazon 100%. Reviews, really. Right. But it's especially the Goodreads reviews. It's like, don't read them. Like, and I think you're right. They're not really there for you as the author. They are there for the readers. But yeah, it's all very tricky and complicated. I think that publishing has only become just that much more of a complex web now that we all interact as much as we do online compared to perhaps how it was in Agatha Christie's day. But that's both a good and a bad thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, one area that I think is really an interesting example of this, and I've actually I happened to mention to you before we started even recording, but my friend Alexa Dunn is an author who also is a author tuber, which is the author side of YouTube.
Oh, I didn't even know that existed. Interesting.
Yeah, she makes great videos. Highly recommend. And she also just got nominated for an Edgar Award for the YA category. So she's becoming a full-on mystery author.
Nice.
She's not paying me to say this, just love Alexa. She's great. But she and I had an interesting conversation where she was pointing out that Instagram is one of the hardest places for this dynamic, because leading up to a book's publication, the hashtag of the title really is a marketing tool for the publisher and the author. Once the book comes out, though, it kind of informally becomes the tag for the reviews. So it's like there's this murky handoff point where, everyone pretty much on Bookish Spacious agrees it's bad form to at authors in your reviews. Like, it's rude. Like, it's, again, the review isn't for them. It's for other readers. Like, don't rub someone's nose in it.
Right.
But you have this murky time where the reviews are starting to come in under that hashtag, but the author may still be trying to use it for promotion and may end up seeing some of those reviews. So I think that there's just, as readers and authors are in spaces together when probably they shouldn't be, probably it would be better for everyone if they had a little bit more separate space. It just gets ugly because the authors are wanting to use this medium to promote, and readers don't want to feel like they have to watch what they're saying in those spaces. So it just creates a lot of drama.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's it's the have your cake and eat it too issue of, I think, authors want to benefit from the fact that they can be more connected to their readers and off of that sell more books and, just get all of this engagement. But then they're like, but I don't want to have to read mean reviews or mean comments or anything like that. And if it's intentional, that's one thing. But I think, as you're saying, often it's unintentional, actually, because we're all just existing in the same space. And similarly, probably with readers, I think it gets so complicated where back in the day, before the internet, we didn't know as much about the people who were creating our content. So you could read something and enjoy it and be blissfully ignorant about any of the other opinions that that person might hold, which you might not like so much. But now that you can easily look up that person's personal Twitter account or, or Facebook page or whatever, then that just gets very complicated and tricky very quickly. And these are the sorts of things that happen when communication and interaction is as easy and seamless as it is. And, we muddle our way through.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, hey, authors, don't be on social media. But I think it takes a level of self-discipline and self-awareness about what version of yourself you're going to bring to the internet, because you can show your butt and the internet will remember forever. It will not forget. Yes. One of my dear friends who actually have a podcast with, Jess Owen, she has a whole series on her channel called Book Community. And it's literally just covering the drama that goes on when, quote unquote, authors behaving badly or readers behaving badly or readers and authors in the same space getting into it. Right. And it's also hard as a public reviewer to kind of walk that line of, I want to create a space that's welcoming for everyone. And there may just be some books that I'm like, you know what, even if I were to read this privately, I don't think I would talk about this publicly because I don't agree with things the author has very publicly done, like Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. That's a great example that's perennially raging online right now. What do you, as a public reviewer or discusser of books, do with that? I've chosen to just not cover her at all on my channel at this point, but it's a tricky line because, I love Agatha Christie, for example. There are things in Agatha Christie's books that to me are pretty gross or things that I would absolutely not stand with. But it's a little different when it's a different time and someone's dead. So you're having to navigate all of those dynamics in a way that's hopefully true to yourself and also respectful of the audience that you're trying to cultivate.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Let's just acknowledge for a second, because I spend so much time on this podcast talking about the trickiness of, the depictions stuck in their time, which is what I've chosen to call them. Many people hate that I call it that. Even just the name that I have for it is controversial, but it actually is a little bit easier dealing with those issues, sticky as they may be, because Agatha Christie is no longer with us, and also because she was writing in a different time. So there's, a non-judgment, at least from me, that, I always try to remind people of, since we don't exist in the same world, and it makes it a different thing. And it's so much harder when you're trying to figure out what to do and what to say about someone who is existing in the same world and making statements and coming out with things. So it's constantly shifting as well. And our own understanding of all these issues is shifting, because no one, has absolute knowledge of anything. So we're all trying to figure it out. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. Well, I was going to try to get to all of that later in our conversation and get to Christie first, but oh well.
We can put a pin in it.
We just went there, which I'm glad we did, because I think it's one of the more fascinating things, I think, about what you do. And I'll say this, as someone who's watched and enjoyed many of your videos, the thing that I appreciate, and which I also try to do, is that you obviously do need to be critical, because otherwise, why are you doing this? You're not, if every video is just like, yeah, I loved it, it was great. That's not interesting, but it always feels constructive, and it always feels, and it's always backed up, with, okay, well, this is what I didn't like, and here's why. And it never feels like, the point is to take a text or an author down. And I so appreciate the overall kind of vibe of that on your channel. And I've always felt that in every video that I've watched. So.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's, there's some people who feel like I shouldn't talk about Agatha Christie at all, like, period. They don't think she should be read. And then there's other people who, like, of all things, like my grandfather, who is in his 80s now, called me a couple months ago and was like, did you hear that they're editing Agatha Christie book? Like, you just can't win in some ways. And I was like, well, Papa, like, if them editing a book for someone allows more people to read and enjoy an author who I love, I'm fine with that. Like, the original texts are always there for scholarly engagement. But, at the end of the day, like, we can acknowledge that somebody isn't perfect, or that the past, I would argue that now is the best time to be alive for all of the problems that we have. Like, like, we have learned so much even from when she was writing about different issues and different experiences that people have had. Like, I can both acknowledge that is a real part of her world and her history, and also say, like, hey, thank God that's not how people think about, for instance, Jewish people today. Or if they do, we all agree, like, that's awful. Don't think that. So, I think it's always a tension, and trying to engage her and her world critically, but with compassion, and engage the text from a place of a ton of celebration. I wouldn't have spent this much time talking about her books if I didn't love them. Yeah. But also saying, like, hey, sometimes she does things that are goofy, or sometimes she includes things that I don't think make a lot of sense, or I find annoying or offensive or whatever. Like, it's just all the different shades of reactions exist.
Absolutely. I've heard from people who think that Catherine and I have done too little as to, these depictions stuck in their time. And then I've heard from people who think we've done too much. And I'm like, you know what? That means we're probably doing it sort of right.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That means probably threading the needle there.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you're never going to make everyone happy. But if I'm somewhere in the middle, then that's the best place to be, not on either extreme. Yeah. All right. So you've posted many videos about Agatha Christie on your channel, including at least 2 in which you rank Christie's work from least favorite to favorite. I love that way that you have of putting it. And those rankings include not just Christie's novels, but her short story collections as well. And of course, since this is all a matter of taste, there were some really interesting ways that you differed from the All About Agatha rankings. And I just wanted to highlight a few of those differences.
Oh no, I'm being called on the carpet for my terrible taste.
and talk about them. No, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what's so fun, I think, about ranking Agatha Christie novels and talking about them. I mean, there are enough of them that it's, a robust exercise, but then also people just differ so much, and for very good reasons. I think it's really possible to back up, wildly differing opinions when it comes to Christie, because there's just so much material there and people respond to it, I think, and, it resonates so deeply with so many people.
I always defer to the Judge John Hodgman rule of people like what they like, and you can't make somebody like something that they just don't like, and vice versa. At the end of the day, some of it is just we all are weird, homebrew of taste, and sometimes you just like something that nobody else likes.
Absolutely. It's the ineffables. And, on our podcast, we would have that setting and tone category, which we completely admitted was a bit of a catch-all, because you have to have that ineffable thing. And you often, I notice in your videos, you talk about vibes or feels, and just because you have to, because you're talking about books, and that's just what it is. It is ineffable. And there's really no talking around that, but it doesn't mean that it's still not fun to talk about it. So the following titles were all in your bottom 10.
Oh, no.
Taken at the Flood, Endless Night, and 3-act tragedy. I am devastated, Mara.
I mean, listen, they're all, so the baseline is, if it's an Agatha Christie, it's probably better than most books I've read. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's not that I hate any of those. I just, so do we want to get into them? What I want to get into problems are?
I'm very curious about those three. And Endless Night, because you talk about Endless Night a couple of times in a couple of different videos, knowing that you're a bit of an outlier on Endless Night. So let's start with Endless Night. Why do you hate Endless Night so much, Mara?
I mean, I think for some of the same reasons I've never been able to get into the Mary Westmacott side of Christie. For me and my taste, it just feels so melodramatic, but without the real mystery part that I enjoy. It just doesn't feel suspenseful to me. It just feels sort of overwrought but it doesn't feel camp. If it was more camp, I think I would like it more.
Right.
So what is that one with Bette Davis where she is slowly going blind and dies at the end? Whatever that was. If that was the vibe, I could be more into it. But it's more I don't know. I think she wants me to take something seriously that for me, just every single line of dialogue just feels like dun, dun, dun at the end. And so, yeah, I know I'm the weirdo on that one, though. I totally accept that other people get more into the atmosphere.
I believe, by the way, that's Dark Victory that you're talking about.
Yes.
Which we have clipped on this podcast before. Yes.
I mean, I love that movie. I'm obsessed, but it is very camp, which I need for my melodrama.
Yeah, no, that was a Catherine Brobeck favorite, actually. I think it's when she said, she's like, there's a storm coming or something like that as her eyesight is fading. Why is it so cloudy? Oh no.
God, that last scene of that movie is truly a work of art. If you have not seen that movie, I commend it to you.
Is Taken at the Flood a little bit for its clunker of an ending, in which we sort of have seemingly, not in a fun way, sort of almost like a domestic violence situation. I mean, it is a misfire, I think, with a lot of 21st century readers.
Yeah, for me, that's exactly what it is. It just, the level of unenjoyment I have of those elements is just in no way outweighed by the enjoyment I have of the conclusion. So I'm left feeling icky and worried about people. And that's just not how I want to leave a Christie.
Yeah. No, I actually completely understand people finishing Taken at the Flood with a bad taste in their mouth, because that ending is just, and it's not just the ending either. I mean, that has been a through line in the book, but it really, she certainly dots that I and crosses that T right at the end of the book. So there's no escaping it. And then 3-act tragedy, I just think is such a clever puzzle. And the ultimate motivation for a murderer is also one of her best. That from the crafting of a mystery puzzle perspective, I absolutely adore it. But what is it about that one that doesn't work for you?
It's been a while since I've read that one, but I seem to remember there's not enough Poirot in it.
Okay.
I want my Poirots to be very Poirot-y and my Marples to be very Marple-y. And if they're not around, then I'm going to be less happy.
You're not happy about that. Yeah. Well, that's the one that has Mr. Satterthwaite. Actually, it is stuffed with a lot of characters.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. And I think I feel about the heroine in that one the way a lot of other people feel about Lady Bundle, which is that they're annoyed with her.
Egg. Yeah.
Yeah. I just didn't, not my favorite flavor of that character.
Sure.
So not, that one's not like with prejudice. That one just is like, I happen to like a lot of other ones better.
Sure. Okay. See, I'm at least, I mean, I'm obviously disagreeing with you on all of these, but I'm understanding your perspective. That's what this is what people need to do more of, right? I'm just trying to understand your perspective.
trying to meet in the middle. I feel like I survived the hot. My sweating has ceased. I feel like I survived that confrontation. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I actually want to talk about a couple other titles, but this will be, I think, in a much kinder way here, because I found it really interesting that on a few key titles, your opinion was totally different from mine and Catherine's, but pretty similar to that of Dr. John Curran, who right. So I'm not going to argue too hard with him, but obviously Dr. Curran came on to discuss the rankings with me in the final rankings episode for the podcast. And the titles I'm talking about now specifically are Nemesis, which you put just outside your bottom 10. The Hollow, you also ranked fairly low. That is in the bottom half of your rankings. And then you put 1-2 Buckle My Shoe squarely in the top half of your rankings. And that lines up with John Curran's thoughts on those titles. He thinks that Nemesis and The Hollow are ranked way too high in our final rankings, and that 1-2 Buckle My Shoe is way too low. And I find that interesting because having listened to your thoughts on Christie in so many of your videos now, I don't get the sense that you actually do value the mechanics of the plot or the puzzle over other considerations, or to the exclusion of other considerations. Not that Dr. Curran does that either, but he would admit that he does weight the plot and puzzle sort of concerns much more heavily when he is thinking about a book, because he's just all about that sort of, the golden age detective novel. So I'm curious why you think you line up with him, maybe, or maybe you do. Maybe it actually is about the puzzle construction. What do you think about that?
No, I'm a very bad mystery fan in the sense of I just want to have fun. Like if I had fun, I will forgive you so much. Now, if I'm not having fun, then I'm going to sit there and pick it apart. And that means you've already lost me. Nemesis, actually, so when I did my reread of Nemesis, I think it happened to be timed very poorly for that book's, my perception of the book, because it happened to be timed right when the whole Christine Blasey Ford accusations against Kavanaugh. And it's just so much about rape culture. And there's several just very egregious throwaways about sexual assault in that book. And I think it may have received, like, my enduring memory of it, of like, that's the one where Agatha Christie reminded me that women have been treated like crap for thousands of years. Like, I think it just happened to be timed in a way that I just couldn't overlook some of that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I can understand that. And that is, I mean, Jamie Bernthal-Hooker and I talked about that when we covered Nemesis on the podcast. It's a huge issue with that book. So that does not surprise me. A lot of other people have the issue that they find it meandering and a little boring. So which I do understand as well. I just, for me, the Miss Marple characterization, and also our murderer, the characterization of the murderer, is just so exquisite that I can forgive it a little bit more.
I will say I revised some of my thoughts after listening to that episode you did, because in my mind, I read it so clearly as queer coded, and that also bothered me. After listening to your discussion, though, I think I have a different perception of that. So I really should go back and reread it with like non-anger eyes and accepting that it's maybe not, a dated depiction of a queer relationship.
Right. And I have to imagine, I mean, I know The Hollow has one of the most egregious instances of anti-Semitism in the canon.
I mean, I feel really bad saying that that's not the reason that I didn't rank it higher, but I do agree it is egregious. For that one, I think I love, and I'm so bad with names, so you'll see that right now. But the main female character in that, I am
Henrietta.
obsessed with. Yes, Henrietta. Oh my gosh. One of my favorite Christie heroines, or like main female leads. She's so interesting and so well. And I just found everyone else to pale in comparison to her.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like it's not a well-balanced book in terms of character interest.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's less that I have a specific problem with it and more just like, I think because to me it feels a little unbalanced, I just like other ones better.
That's so interesting. I can totally see that, especially also because, there's a little bit of that love triangle, not spoiling anything about the murder, but there's a little bit of that love triangle since she's having an affair, and the wife within that love triangle, Gerda, is such a retreating kind of a character, and she doesn't have a big presence. And I think that, that's entirely intentional on Christie's part because that's who she is. But I could see the effect being an imbalance of just almost like, not quite page real estate, but like mental real estate in you as a reader. That's interesting. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean, One Shoe Buckle My Shoe, I think actually it's a really neat puzzle, actually. So I just wanted to point out that there are others who like it a lot.
Yeah. And I think for me, so I tend to be a really big kind of like social and history reader of Christie. Like that actually is one of the problems I have with Taken at the Flood is I want more World War II stuff in that or like post-war stuff. Not that she owes that to me, but I just would have enjoyed it more if it was there. But I love all of the kind of depictions of the politics in One Shoe Buckle My Shoe. Like, I just think it's really interesting as a kind of sampling of its time in that respect. So like, I really enjoy thinking through the solution to the mystery layered on top of those characters' depictions politically. I just find that very engaging.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. I did not find it as engaging myself, but that makes sense to me. By the way, I believe that you said in one of these videos that The Hollow is actually the first Christie that you ever read. Is that right?
So I was finishing my time studying abroad in London, and I picked up Halloween Party and The Hollow in Heathrow, and I can't remember which of those two I read first, but it was either The Hollow or Halloween Party.
That's really great. Quite a contrast, actually.
Yes, but I love them both. I mean,
Yeah, both Poirots. I mean, I also just had to point out that The Secret of Chimneys is ranked 24th out of 76 titles.
Listen, Kemper, this gets back to people like what they like. And like, I think also because it's one of the first audiobooks I got. And I used to live in DC and I would travel back to Tennessee to visit my family. So I listened to so many Christies on audio, and it was one of the first ones I did that with. And I have re-listened to that so many times that I think it's also just like a repetition creates fondness kind of situation.
Yep. I mean, I hope you appreciated my justice for the Secret of Chimneys episode.
I did, honestly. I was like, you know what? It took you a while, but I'm glad that you've seen the light. No, I'm just no, I don't defend it on its quality. That's why I specifically ranked it based on my favorites.
Yeah. No, there are many that feel similarly. There's a lot of affection out there for the Secret of Chimneys, and I understand it more at this point in my study of Agatha Christie. This episode is sponsored by BritBox. You all know that I love a good period mystery, listeners, but I also have a taste for contemporary mysteries, and I am loving the BritBox original program Payback, which stars Morven Christie, no relation to Agatha, alas. Morven was in Grantchester, as well as the Labors of Hercules episode of Suchet's Poirot, but we won't hold that against her. So in this show, she plays a grieving widow who ends up discovering that her accountant husband was potentially embroiled in Scotland's criminal underworld. What's that? A wife whose husband was keeping secrets from her? This is wonderfully familiar territory, but it's told in a fresh new way with fantastic acting. I think you'll all really enjoy it, along with any number of the hundreds upon hundreds of shows on offer over at BritBox. Gripping crime dramas, classic mysteries, comedies, documentaries, and more, all in one convenient place. So sign up for BritBox today and see why the New York Times calls it the best of British telly. I have a special limited time offer for my US and Canadian listeners. Get 50% off your first month when you sign up for a monthly plan, but only if you go to BritBox.com and use my promo code Agatha at checkout. So don't wait. Get 50% off your first month. Use promo code Agatha at BritBox.com. All right, I just want to run through your top 10. Not that I'm going to ask you to talk about each one of these titles, don't worry, but people are just generally curious about top 10s. So I figured I may as well list them. Starting with number 10 and moving up. The 13 Problems, that is your favorite short story collection. I concur. Lord Edward Dies, Murder at the Vicarage, Sleeping Murder, After the Funeral, Murder on the Orient Express, Crooked House, Death on the Nile, and Then There Were None. And I would like for you to tell us your number one, Mara, your absolute favorite Christie, because it's a really interesting one.
My favorite Christie, which I have to tell you, I was surprised to discover this in my rereading project, but my favorite one is Cards on the Table.
Do you play bridge?
I do not. I have done a lot of Googling in my time since reading that book, trying to understand the mechanics of what is going on those sections.
Yeah, well, I mean, Cards on the Table really is one of my favorites. It's ranked pretty high, and
I mean, a little low. Let's just be. I mean, I didn't want to get to this, but like, it's a little low, Kepper. Let's be honest.
It's one of those ones where when I sit down and I look at what's above it, there's just nothing that I feel like I can replace it with, but I feel bad by how low it is as well. You know, I feel like this should be and could be rectified somehow, but when I sit down and look at it, I just can't. I feel that way about Cards on the Table. I feel that way about Lord Edward Dies, actually. I also feel that way about the ABC Murders, which I know you don't like as much. That one's, I think, much lower in your rankings.
It is. I will say that's one that I've grown a lot more fondness for. Like, I need to do another reread, and I think it would probably jump up pretty significantly. But yeah, I'm the weirdo who doesn't consider that to be like one of her very best.
Yeah, that's a bit of an outlier opinion, I suppose, and quite different from Dr. Curran, who absolutely adores the ABC. One of his very favorite. But I think there are a lot of people who share that opinion. It's a little awkwardly written too. It's one of those ones that conceptually, it's a book that after you've finished it and then you think about it, it gets better because you're like, wow, this is really doing so many different things. And it's so brilliant in her treatment of xenophobia. I mean, it's one of her few books where actually, you know, she's dealing with xenophobia in a really interesting way and making some incisive points. And that's certainly not something that I usually credit Agatha Christie with. There's that, and there's the serial killer aspect, and, you know, the multiple victims and the sort of overarching victim who isn't even one of the murder victims. There's so much going on there. But the experience of reading the book is a little awkward, actually, because we have that flipping back of perspectives, and, you know, it's not perfect. It's not perfect.
I think it was a disservice to my reading experience that people pitched it to me as, oh, this is Agatha Christie's serial killer book. And I think because that was my expectation when I first read it, I've never fully recovered that, because I do think it's such a, I mean, fun feels like a weird thing to say in terms of murdering, but it's such a fun book in terms of just, it's so clever. And I do think that the solution is really satisfying. But it doesn't, if you're reading it as a serial killer book, it's not that satisfying to me on that level.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me. And it's also, it's a little bit, you know, I think Cards on the Table is kind of a flip side of the ABC Murders, at least as we've been talking about it, because it is such an elegant book. I mean, that book is just, it's beautifully written and it's tight and it works, but it also has, you know, it has the Christie lightness and humor and wackiness. It goes into a totally wacky place by the end of the book, where you're like, what is happening? And I love being able to say, what is happening at the end of an Agatha Christie book? And yet she still sells it. It has everything. It really, we talk about how Peril at End House is such a Christie-esque book, but I think you could make the same argument that Cards on the Table is like a quintessential Christie.
For me, Cards on the Table has almost, with one slight modification, everything that I love best in Christie. The slight modification is that it's a locked room mystery instead of an isolated closed circle. Like my favorite trope is And Then There Were None. Like that, I could read, I can and do read like one or two of those a month. And it doesn't matter if it's not a good version of it. I just love it when they're all trapped together. Somebody dies. You got to figure out who did it before you get got. Like, love that. But it is a locked room mystery. So like there is that sort of isolation element. it has, to me, such great characterization of our suspects, and it spends so much time digging into their psychology in a way that I think is really effective. Like, I really buy these characters, even though they do have some wacky motivations going on.
Yeah.
In particular, the Colonel, I feel like all of his motivation stuff is pretty over the top.
Yeah.
But I buy it because I really buy them as people. I think the clues are the kind of clues that Christie handles best. Like, it doesn't get too forensic, which I think is not necessarily her biggest strength. And I adore Christie short stories. Like, I could just read them all day, every day. So to me, I also like that it almost reads like a set of 4 interconnected novellas in a way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also love it when she does cold case stuff. So I think that's so satisfying. The end is it feels like the only solution that it could have really been now that we know these people. I don't know. I love that book so much. And I love the David Suchet adaptation of it. They change a few things, but I think all in a way that's actually serving it and not, I have some problems with some of the changes they make in the Suchet adaptations, which is maybe a different conversation for a different time. But in this case, I think that it totally supports what is great about that book.
Yeah. It's I raised my eyebrow at a few of the changes. I don't know if I'm as gung ho on the Suchet adaptation, but obviously in general, I of course adore the Suchet adaptations, and it's actually, I think it's a tricky book to adapt because unlike most Christies, it is so spare. But I love that point that you made about the fact that she's really able to dig deep into the characters of each of the suspects, because that's what happens when you only have 4 suspects. And usually Christie is juggling so many more plates and spinning them and doing what she does. And there's so much, logistics, but we don't really have that here. So she's doing something slightly different, but doing it in her style that we've come to know and love by that point. So yeah, well, I love that we were able to just geek out over Cards on the Table, because it's worth doing that every now and then. By the way, I'm sure there will be many of you listeners wondering, since I read out that top 10, where the heck The Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Five Little Pigs are on Mara's list. And I will just note that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is at number 15 and Five Little Pigs is at number 20, both of which are just way too low, but they're still pretty high in your rankings.
Well, let's say I feel similarly about both of those as you feel about Cards on the Table, which is I just can't figure out what I would put above it.
Yeah.
Or like what I would swap out with it.
Yeah.
But again, it's favorites, not best. I would put both of those in the top 10 for like best quality, but they're not my favorites.
The other novel that I think comes through as one of your favorites, which I just want to shout out for a second, both in your latest rankings video and then in a couple of the others, is Appointment with Death, actually, which comes in at 12 of 76 in your rankings, which means it beats both Five Little Pigs and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which I think is insane. But I also actually I do like Appointment with Death, but you like it a lot more. And when I listened to you talk about it, I actually felt like perhaps the book hadn't gotten all the love that it deserves on the podcast. So I would just love if you could talk about why you adore Appointment with Death so much.
It has the best villain. Like, I hate that lady so much whenever I read it. I'm like, I cannot wait for you to get got. Like, you are such a piece of trash. Like, she's so hateable. And I think it's also, to me, something Christie does really well is build villains who are despicable, not because of like grand, big picture world things, but like because of how cruel they are to the people directly around them. And she is just such a little toady tyrant. And I just love how much Christie makes me hate her. Like, it's so effective to me. Yeah. And then I actually really like the solution to it a lot. Like, it's not, if we're going on realistic, I'm not going to sit here and argue to you that it's plausible, but it is very satisfying. And I remember the first time I read it being like, oh my gosh, like, I love this as a motivation, and I don't want to spoil. But I love that kind of solution. Actually, I just realized that's a very similar motivation to Cards on the Table in some ways. I really like that kind of motivation. I think it's really interesting and it keeps me on my toes in a way that I find very fun.
There's so much focus in Appointment with Death on that family, on the Boyntons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how dysfunctional they are. And it's all done so well. And then, this is a minor spoiler. So fast forward 30 seconds if you haven't yet read Appointment with Death, but the ultimate solution doesn't really have anything to do with that, right? Like it has nothing to do with the family dynamics. It has to do with something completely outside of the family. And that irked me because so much of the book was focused on the family, but it's interesting that I guess the out of left fieldness, the surprise of that was what worked for you actually as a mystery reader.
I love that as a Christie motivation of like, oh crap, like now is my chance.
Yeah.
And I think I enjoy that as a motivation because to me it feels like successful misdirection rather than out of left field. Sometimes it feels clunkier, but I also, it's a bold, so like, Murder in Mesopotamia, that ending is absolutely bonkers, but I love it because it's so insane. And I kind of just love it when she'll go for it. Like, you know what, Agatha, this morning you woke up and you were like, you know what, I'm going to try something. And I find that kind of lovely and exciting.
Yes. No, that's great. And that all makes so much sense to me. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who love Appointment with Death, and it's just not one that's been sung all that much on the podcast. So
it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, one of my very favorite videos that you did was about Agatha Christie as an extended reading experiment. And in this experiment, you covered 4 different mystery books, all of which were said to be, I'm using air quotes here, like Agatha Christie. And then you analyzed whether or not they really were like Agatha Christie. And first off, because you are the only person that I've seen talk about this phenomenon at great length, and I think I'm sure that it's something that many listeners of this podcast have remarked on. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon in which so many contemporary mysteries are compared to Agatha Christie when they're being marketed?
Yeah, it's a real, I was about to say it's a real problem. It is a real problem. Also, I'm aware that, we live on a dying planet. So I understand it's
there are other problems too, but
that we have. But in the scope of the bookish world, I do think we have a real problem with publishers being so focused on marketing books via an elevator pitch. They really love to be able to say, like, Knives Out is the perfect example. It's Clue meets Wes Anderson.
Right.
You can say that and you're like, oh yeah, like that actually is what that is. But most things are not so easily reduced. And when people are trying to communicate, this is an actual mystery. This has a puzzle component in terms of it's not a thriller, it's not suspense. Like, I am telling you that this is an actual mystery. They're going to say it's like Agatha Christie. Right. And it is not usually. It may be a true mystery, but that may be the only thing it has in common with Agatha Christie.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because it struck me while I was listening to this extended reading experiment that you did that Christie is a writer uniquely difficult to imitate because she has, right? I mean, she has a very specific writing style. She writes unlike any other person who was writing in her time or after her or really before her. And I've talked so much about it on the podcast. It's spare and she often has this sort of like, she manages to write on a grand kind of mythological scale and her descriptions are pithy. And yet somehow you see, the house or the landscape that she's describing in just a couple of words. And it's, it's quite masterful, even though it seems simple and it's so easy to dismiss. So she is unique and difficult to imitate. And yet she, more than almost any other author, is the one who is so often held out as an attainable comparison for the mercenary reason that she continues to be such a bestseller. So it's like, hey, it's like Agatha Christie, so buy it because you want to.
Exactly.
And it's such a mismatch and it's all rather cynical and frustrating.
Well, and I do want to acknowledge for non-geeks like us who just like have read a couple of Christie's and are like, oh yeah, I like that kind of a mystery. It might sometimes be a helpful comparison to give them a sense of the kind of book they're getting within the very broad umbrella of mystery, thriller, suspense. Like there's so many different subgenres and flavors. Like sometimes I think it can be a helpful comparison to give people a sense of which subgenre this book is in.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of the takeaway from that writing experiment or the reading experiment. The writing is so hard to capture because it is just so perfectly effervescent and wry and very Jane Austen-like, in my opinion, in terms of like, she can just give you a one-liner and you know exactly who this person is and also like kind of make fun of them at the same time. Like it's such a specific writing voice that I think is nearly impossible for anyone to meet. And so as a lover of Christie, if you tell me something is like her, in my mind, that's like one of the things I'm getting. And it's just pretty much impossible to give that to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like there's the lowest possible threshold is it should at least be a whodunit more or less, or feature
that
a
would
puzzle.
be a good place to start. Yeah.
Right. Like I hopefully if you say it's like Agatha Christie, it's not a psychological thriller with an unreliable female narrator, a la The Girl on the Train, but like sometimes it is. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly. And that is a problem. I think that, and it does a disservice to the book and the writer because it's setting up a bad expectation. But you know, I'm trying to think. The Golden Spoon, that came out this year. If somebody wants to say that's like, I think the pitch for that was Agatha Christie meets The Great British Bake Off. I think that's a perfectly reasonable pitch for that.
Sure. Or Richard Osman, you know, especially the first one, they've actually gotten less puzzly, I think, as they've gone on. But, you know, the first one does feature a puzzle, a whodunit sort of a puzzle. And it has effervescence, even though it's not Christie-ish effervescence per se. I think that it's fair to say that it's in the spirit of Agatha Christie. But yeah, it gets abused. It gets overused and abused. And it is frustrating. It was interesting because, you know, you read 4 books for this reading experiment and you ended up actually kind of liking all of them actually. And yet the 2 that you liked the most even, which was you read Brat Farrar by Josephine Tey. Tey is one of my very favorites of Christie's contemporaries. I love Miss Kim Disposes in particular is one of my very favorite mysteries.
I got to dive back into her because that's the only one I've read, but I really did enjoy it.
Yeah, no, she's so talented. And then you finally took the plunge and read The Monogram Murders by podcast friend Sophie Hannah, and also very much enjoyed it. But neither of those 2 books passed the "is this actually like Agatha Christie" test, right?
Yeah, and I felt really so. People have been asking me to read Sophie Hannah for years, and I was like, I had said I'm never going to do this while I am publicly reviewing because I just don't think I can be fair to it. But I finally decided to go for it. And I was pleasantly surprised. Like it did better than I expected, but I just don't, it's just such a hard thing to meet the expectations of if you're using one of my all-time favorite characters and you're supposed to be writing like my favorite author. It's just not fair to her for me to really try to decide if it's like Agatha Christie because it's like, well, it is and it isn't. And there's nothing you can do about it because you are not Agatha Christie.
Right. And the funny thing is, I mean, and not really to speak for Sophie, although I kind of sort of will since she's like not literally here in this conversation, but I think that she would probably say, yeah, I'm not Agatha Christie. And those books are not really intended to even be written in an imitative way. And she kind of puts you on notice about that right away, and that there's a different first person narrator. And it's just, it's so different from the first sentence that you're like, oh, okay, well, obviously we're still in Poirot land here, but it's just it's a different beast, you know?
Yeah. And I read that Marple collection they put out last year, and I actually loved that. I do wonder if it's somewhat because I am more of a Poirot girl than a Marple girl. But I think maybe somewhat that is because those were short stories, and because they were all these different authors with a different take, it was easier for me to get into the mindset of like, this is an interpretation of it. This is like a different perspective on this character. And I thought that there were some great examples in there of pretty, which one was it? the Ruth Ware, I thought this is probably the closest to like Christie I've maybe ever read outside of Christie. Like, I thought it was pretty solid.
No, I agree. I mean, I talked about this on the episode that I did with Brad Friedman, another friend of the podcast. But I think, and not that even this was necessarily intentional, but when you're reading a short story collection, so, you know, and you're going to read more than one of them probably in a sitting, if not all of them, it becomes this exercise in literary possibility. So it forces you, I think, to engage in that exercise in a really productive spirit, because you're just sort of like, oh yeah, there are so many different directions that you could take this, and like, oh, here was one, and here's another, and here's another, and you know, you might put the book down and be like, I don't like this, but if it works for you, you're just going to be charmed, I think, by those differences, as opposed to put off by them. And when all you have is, you know, one effort, you have a long form novel, it might work for you, it might not, but you don't have that same sort of feeling of possibility that I think the collection actually was able to provide. And I was really almost moved by it in a weird way. Just, I think, as a lover of literature and Agatha Christie and experimentation, I was just sort of like, I absolutely love that this collection exists. Like, I'm so happy that I'm reading it right now. And I wasn't necessarily expecting to feel that way.
Yeah, I totally know what you mean, because some of what I felt reading it was, this feels like an act of reclamation, kind of circling back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, of these are authors from, you know, identities that I don't think Christie did or would have treated very well in her books. And they're getting to write a version of Marple that is accepting of that, or embracing of that, or even just from a different perspective. Like, I found that to be really a testament to the power of Marple as a character, and the Christie kind of formula as something that's enduring and can be reused by other people. Like, I found it to be a really kind of, a strangely like moving, like you were saying, experience reading, because it's like, oh yeah, like Marple is for everyone. Like everybody loves this little old lady who, you know, people just drop dead wherever she goes. Like, this is fun for us all.
Yeah. You get a Marple, you get a Marple.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's, it was a really great collection. I hope that they do more of them. Well, you already actually mentioned that you love the Suchet Cards on the Table episode. And I know there are a bunch of the David Suchet adaptations that you really, really enjoyed. I also know, because you have an over 20 minutes rant, that's your term, an over 20-minute rant about Kenneth Branagh's Death on the Nile, and also Murder on the Orient Express. I know you are not as big of a fan of Branagh's Poirot. So we can talk about that a little bit. But I also wanted to talk about the Miss Marple adaptations that are out there, because I'm extrapolating a little bit, I think, from what you haven't said than what you have. So perhaps you can correct me here. But I think at one point you said you never really clicked with any of the Miss Marple adaptations. So I guess what I'm really asking is why you hate Joan Hickson.
Well, she shot my dad in Reno just to watch him die. So no, I just never clicked. Well, you know, here, let's put this in a positive way. I think it's because I love the Angela Lansbury interpretation of Marple so much that nothing else can measure up to it.
So yeah, you are a huge fan of The Mirror Cracked.
Obsessed.
Yeah.
Love that movie.
We'll talk about camp, right? I mean,
it is so, and also the fact that Angela Lansbury was not maybe as soon as she finished filming the movie, like at the wrap party, awarded an Oscar for her portrayal of what's her name, Salome, in Death on the Nile.
Sure.
It's just a crime against the acting profession. Like that, oh man, those are so camp, and I just am obsessed.
Yeah, it's like, forget Ingrid Bergman in Murder on the Orient Express. Angela Lansbury truly did deserve an Oscar for Death on the Nile. It's a fact. That's a fact.
Sometimes they just get it wrong, and this is one of those times.
That's a little bit of a controversial opinion, because there are a lot of people that really did not enjoy Angela Lansbury's turn as Miss Marple in The Mirror Cracked. It's a curious movie. It's a curious movie.
I think I do love all things camp, so that's I'm sure a part of it.
Sure.
I think I probably also was in the tank for it because before I saw that, I was obsessed with Murder, She Wrote. So like I was, and you know,
were primed.
yeah, and that movie Mirror Cracked is the reason they even wrote Murder, She Wrote was because they were like, oh, Angela Lansbury, this is the role she was born to play.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, so that's probably part of it. Is it's kind of a mishmash with Jessica Fletcher. But no, I do love that. And I never really fully clicked with the other versions. It's nothing against them. And to be fair, I should probably try again. It's been, 10 years.
Or, you've got a lot of books on your roster. You're forgiven for not having watched every, every single Agatha Christie adaptation multiple times. You've got a lot going on. It's all good.
Yeah.
And I just on the adaptation front, I wanted to ask you as well, because it very much comes across that you're not a purist. I mean, you've talked multiple times about the fact that, you enjoy different interpretations, and if changes are made for a reason or even are just interesting or illuminating in some way, you're all for it. And I know at one point, you referenced Sarah Phelps's "And Then There Were None." That's, those recent BBC licenses in a positive way, which I agree with you. Yeah. I think there's a lot of really great things to say about that. Have you watched any of the other Sarah Phelps adaptations? Because they're very controversial.
Yes, I have. I would say that to me, none of them are total failures. Like, how to say this nicely? To me, I'm so happy the Kenneth Branagh movies are happy, truly, because it does make people get into Christie. Yeah. It makes people go read the books. I'm always excited to see any adaptation of her do well. Like, truly, wholeheartedly, I feel that way.
Yeah.
I think artistically, they're nearly total failures. Moving swiftly onwards, I don't feel that way about the Sarah Phelps ones. Even if they make choices that I don't personally love, I feel like I see where she's coming from with it. And like, it's an interesting take that I think is like somewhere in the text. Like it usually is highlighting some piece of subtext that I'm like, right. Okay, I hadn't thought about that, but like, that's an interesting thing to pull out of this.
It might be buried. It might be glancing, but I suppose it's somewhere in there.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere. So I'm like, okay. And also I just think the production value is so great. So like, I love the costumes. There's something for me in those adaptations, even if they're not a favorite. But yeah, the Kenneth Branagh ones, not as much. Listen, people love negativity. They can say what they want. I see the numbers. They love it when I get mad about stuff.
Moving off of the adaptations, I did just want to ask you about one other project of yours, which is something that I've been meaning to touch on the podcast for some time now. So you attempted to solve Cain's jawbone.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So I am just going to very quickly sort of lay out what this is. And then I want to ask you about your experience, because I know that you did this, but I didn't watch your post on it because I was worried about having it be spoiled even a little bit, because I haven't done it myself, but I do plan on doing it at some point. Mm-hmm. So I have no idea what your experience was. And I'm very curious to hear about it. But just real quick, Cain's Jawbone is something that I'll bet many listeners have heard about and potentially tried to solve themselves. It's a puzzle mystery published in 1934 by Edward Powys Mathers. He was an English translator and poet. He was also an early champion of cryptic crosswords. He wrote the novel under the pseudonym Torquemada, and he did puzzles under that pseudonym. So it really is, I think more so than your average golden age detective novel, it was straddling the line between puzzle and novel. Mm-hmm. Like and that will make sense in a second. It really is both of those things and kind of neither of those things. So essentially, the book, which I believe is 100 pages, comes out of order. And the puzzle that the reader has to solve is putting these pages in the exact correct order, at which point you will be able to solve, because you can read it, you'll be able to solve, who the murderer is and how they did it. And it is apparently an extremely difficult thing to solve. There were, I think, 2 people who solved it in the 30s when it first came out, and then it was reissued in 2019, at which point it became a bit of a BookTok phenomenon, from what I understand. So I would love if you could share with us your experience of Cain's Jawbone.
Well, first, I'm just going to tell you, Kemper, there is no way to spoil it. Like, not only can you, when you do this, I encourage you to watch as much content as you can about it.
Okay.
Because it is pretty astonishing, actually, just like as an artifact. Like, it is so, okay, I'm trying to even think about how to talk about this because it's such a wormhole of confusion and chaos. It is such an interesting reading experience as somebody in the 2020s trying to read back into it, because at the time, it is filled with references. Like, I'm talking pretty much every other word is a reference of some kind to like poetry or an event or, well, I don't want to, there's like one key you can use to help decipher some of it, but there's a specific book it references a lot. Like, it is so filled with references in its own time. Now, in the 2020s, trying to understand references that were obscure when it was written.
Oh, that's interesting. Is like impossible, right?
Yeah. And as an American, trying to understand specifically British references. Because there's a lot of like brand references. It is a really, really layered text. I would actually love, well, whenever I am done licking my wounds and am ready to look at it again, at some point I should go and do like a JSTOR search to see what kind of scholarship is out there on it, because it's like a pretty astonishing little piece of dense reference and thought process. You're not even sure how many people are murdered and or how many murderers there are really. Like it takes a lot of scrutinization to even understand that a murder has happened on a page.
I'm scared.
I mean, I want you to be equipped. I want you to have compassion for yourself when you get into this, because like it is, I mean, of anybody that I know, I am sure that you are going to do better on it than most, because I think you may get some of the references without having to do a ton of Googling. But yeah, it is quite an experience and it's very humbling. So if you need to have some ego check, I recommend this book.
Well, I'm still smarting from when I did that live play of a game, the Hunt a Killer game, Mystery of Hunter's Lodge, and that did not go well. That did not go well. And I realized playing a game IRL is a very different exercise from reading a text. And reading texts are my happy place. And games that are outside of text, even tangential to texts, are not necessarily. So I tired of it, I think, more quickly than others who are more used to playing games would have. And I suspect that something similar might happen with this puzzle, but I'm very intrigued.
Yeah, it's definitely worth, I think it's a really cool artifact. So it's definitely worth engaging with. But I just want you, like, I don't want you to have ego death when you attempt to solve it.
It actually reminds me of, just stay with me here, this is a really weird reference to make, but it reminds me of Thackeray's Vanity Fair. Christie was a huge Thackeray fan because that book was written, I forget when, it's written in the mid 19th century, but it's set about 20 to 30 years earlier. It's set in the early 19th century, and there are actually so many very specific references.
Oh, you're totally right. Yeah.
Like to popular culture and things. And I remember reading an annotated version of it when I think I read it twice. And I did it as I'm sure you can relate to this. When you're an avid reader, you usually read books way too young. So it's like you do your first read when you understood like a quarter of it, but you still loved it. And then you're like, maybe I should read that now that I actually have the tools to understand what the heck it was that I supposedly loved so much. So I read it again, and it was an annotated version. I was just like, oh my God, because a lot of it is very much like, remember when? Like it's him basically saying like,
it's like, no, I don't.
Yeah. And it's like, no, remember. I don't. I mean, I know your readers did remember like all the fashions and all, when everyone was listening to that music, like at Vauxhall and all this stuff. And it's just like, there's so much going on there that is lost to us now, both, because of the time in which we're reading it and also the place. So it sounds like something similar is going on here, but I love the anthropological journey that those sorts of works force you to take. That's really cool. Yeah.
I mean, I was similar. I read like all of those Victorian classics when I was like a kid through middle schoolish.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I just enjoyed them on a pure story basis.
Yeah.
Like if I didn't understand something, I just assumed it was because I was a kid and I just kept on pushing. I don't think I would be as successful reading them now because I would think, oh, I'm an adult. Surely I can figure this out. And sometimes you need, the Oxford Companion to break it down for you step by step so that you can understand what's happening.
Right. Even Austen, actually, the last time during the pandemic, when so many people, couldn't read anything because it was just so hard to concentrate, I treated myself to Pride and Prejudice because I was like, well, surely I can handle Pride and Prejudice, for the 18th time. And I read a recent annotated version of that came out, I believe, for its 200th anniversary. So it was like 600 pages long because there was of this sort of, and it was really interesting how much there even was there because she is so specifically evoking her time. So, the choices that she's making as to what everyone's wearing and the carriages that they're riding in and, just things that are just completely, lost or that you just have to gloss over. And, I guess you can do that to a certain extent with any work of literature because it's being created by a person living in a specific time and place. So, cool.
Well, I mean, if somebody were going to sit down and try to decipher, like even my, text messages in 200 years, they would be like, what, who knows what this brand is or what this little random piece of slang is or whatever. Like it's astonishing how quickly that is lost to time.
Oh yeah. They'd be like, these initialisms are killing me.
Yeah, exactly.
What does she mean?
LOL?
Yeah. Lol. I have a friend who insists on reading LOL as lol, like a sort of like hearty old English belly laugh. It kind of works, Yeah.
There's something kind of like guttural there that works out. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have taken up so much of your time and this has been just a joy as I knew it would be, but I'm not going to let you go until I make you choose. This is always the last question. And I am just going to note here that this is a slightly more fraught decision for Mara to make than most guests that I have on the podcast, because Mara has a cat named Hastings. So you'd think that there's an easy answer to this. However, she has another cat named Marple. So really, I'm asking you not only to choose detectives, but also to choose between your two cats. Go.
Okay, so Kemper, as you said that, Hastings literally just walked up and sat on my feet.
He knows.
So he knows. He's literally looking at me with his little eyes. Man, I mean, I love this cat literally more than my own life, but I have to, I'm sorry, bud. It has to be Poirot. The only reason he's not named Poirot is because I thought it'd be very funny to have a cat named Captain Arthur Hastings.
That's a great cat name. Yes.
Yeah. And Poirot is kind of a mouthful just to be calling on the daily. So.
It sure is.
Yeah. But so, I mean, it is Poirot. He is my favorite detective, and he's just such a pompous little adorable bundle of gray cells. And he's so smart and yet so blind somehow at the same time. And I just love him so much.
I mean, how can I argue with that? I mean, I could, but I won't. That's lovely. I will begrudgingly have to admit defeat.
I do love Marple, though. I mean, not just my cat, but also the detective. I remember before I did Mission Marple not remembering loving her as much. But I had such an appreciation for how interesting of a character she is in that reread. I do think that Christie may be exploring supplemental female rage through the Marple character. So I like that as an angle. There's no wrong answer between the two.
That is the best answer of all. Of course, it's why it's, the Sophie's choice that it is. Well, Mara, thank you so much for coming on. Your angle into Christie, given that you are as online and I think as engaged in the online world as you are, was just really a valuable one to get, and one that I don't think that we've explored as much as I would like to on this podcast. So I'm really glad that we were able to speak with you about what you do. And I am going to include some links to Mara's Booktube, of course, in the show notes to this episode, and then to her various presences on social media. So I encourage everyone, of course, to check out her channel on Booktube and just to generally get acquainted with her and that whole world, because even though there are some pitfalls to the interwebs out there, there's also so much great content, and I think it's worth exploring.
Yeah, well, it's beyond an honor to join you on this podcast. This is what I listen to whenever I'm prepping a Christie video. I just listen to you guys and to you in the background to like get myself in the mood. So it is surreal and wonderful to be here. And yeah, there's so many book nerds out there online. So if you're looking for community or a way to connect with others, there are some Christie dude bros out there. I can't lie, some know-it-alls. But for the most part, Christie fans are so lovely online and so full of interesting perspectives and little factoids. So definitely jump on in.
Thank you, Mara.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Mara Sinclair. That was a fascinating conversation. As was probably obvious during that conversation, I've been following Mara and I'm a big fan of hers. But even so, I wasn't all that familiar with the Booktube movement. And I just think that was a great opportunity to learn about another way in which readers are coming together and finding out about new titles, discussing titles among themselves. So I do encourage you all to check out Mara's channel on YouTube. I have provided a link to it in the notes to this episode. For next week's episode, I am bringing you another interview. I think you are going to love this one as well. This is actually the third episode in my ongoing series all about Agatha and the theater. I will be interviewing Mark Shanahan, who is the writer and director of a new theatrical adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. That's right. There is a new Murder of Roger Ackroyd on the scene. It has already been performed here in the US. It has been duly licensed by the Agatha Christie estate. We will get into all of that and what Mark has done in his adaptation of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd that seemingly no one has done before. We had a really interesting conversation about adaptational mechanisms, I guess you could say. Can't wait to bring you that conversation. You, of course, could always check out the podcast's Patreon page, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha, or click on the link in the notes to this episode. November's episode was all about Love from a Stranger, the 1937 feature film starring Basil Rathbone and Anne Harding and Joan Hickson. And my December episode is going to be Christmas themed. This has become a tradition over on Patreon. It started with me and Catherine, and I have continued on that tradition in Catherine's absence, reviewing a few Christmas themed short stories for everyone's holiday delight and pleasure. So that's what's happening over on Patreon. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books. And please give the podcast a rating and or review. I know I say this every time, but I do it because it really does help the podcast out, and it means a lot to me if you take just a little bit of time to give your thoughts on the show. Thank you in advance for that, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pair Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.